At my son's wedding rehearsal dinner, my daughter-in-law turned to me, her smile flawless under the chandelier lights, and said the best gift would be if you disappeared from our family. I just smiled and walked away. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far this truth travels. The evening was supposed to be perfect, the kind of night every mother dreams about. White lilies filled the reception hall. Soft jazz played in the background. Waiters carried trays of champagne flutes, and laughter floated through the air like tiny fireworks. My son, Ethan, was marrying the woman he claimed was his soulmate. I'd spent weeks helping plan this celebration, paying the deposits, meeting florists, even choosing the cake flavor. Lemon chiffon, because she once said it reminded her of childhood summers. And now, standing here, surrounded by people I barely knew, I realized that I was nothing more than the old lady paying for everything. Riley, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, glided across the floor in her silk dress, every hair perfectly in place. When she reached me, her perfume was sharp and expensive. Her words were gentle enough that only I could hear them. The best gift would be if you disappeared from our family. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The noise of the room faded. My hands trembled slightly as I held my glass. She smiled wider, as if she'd just said something charming. Then she turned, linking her arm through Ethan's, and walked away as if nothing had happened. Ethan didn't look back. I stood there, frozen between the laughter of strangers and the shimmering table lights. The place I'd rented, the decor I'd paid for, all of it suddenly looked different, like a stage where I no longer belonged. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just sat down at the corner table, pretending to adjust the place cards. Riley's laughter echoed from across the room. "She's finally learning her place," I heard someone whisper. Learning my place. The phrase followed me all the way home. The next morning, sunlight filtered through my kitchen curtains. The bouquet from the rehearsal dinner sat on the counter, already wilting. I poured myself coffee and watched a petal fall. It hit the counter without a sound. On the fridge, a photograph from Ethan's childhood. Him at 7 years old, holding the wooden toy car we built together. His hair messy, his smile wide. He used to call me his hero. Somewhere between that little boy and the man I saw last night, something had broken. I reached for the folder I kept in the kitchen drawer. House documents, mortgage papers, receipts. My name was still there on every page. I'd bought this home with my late husband long before Riley existed. It was where Ethan grew up. The place he once swore he'd always cherish. Now it was just an asset they planned to inherit. I sipped my coffee slowly. Outside, the autumn leaves were turning gold. The same gold I'd paid for on every decoration in that wedding hall. Around noon, Ethan stopped by. He stood at the doorway, eyes darting between me and the living room. "Mom, Riley didn't mean what she said last night. You know how stressed brides can get." I nodded. "Of course." Relief softened his features. "Good, I knew you'd understand. Oh, and could you bring the house key tomorrow? The photographer wants some shots on the porch, and Riley's decorator might come early." "The house key?" "My house key." I smiled faintly. "Sure, sweetheart." He kissed my cheek distractedly and left. His cologne lingered, too polished, too distant. That night, I went to the storage room and opened the old cedar chest where I kept my husband's things. Inside was a small velvet box containing our wedding rings. I held them in my palm, feeling their weight. He would have known what to do. He always did. I whispered, "You'd tell me to stop crying and start thinking." And so I did. I started thinking. By morning, the plan had already formed itself. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I called my attorney, Martin Reynolds, the same man who'd handled our estate after my husband passed. "Martin," I said, my voice calm, "I need to discuss selling my property, discreetly, today." He paused. "Are you sure, Alice? That's quite sudden." "Yes," I replied. "It's time to disappear. Consider it my gift." When I hung up, I looked around the living room one last time. The family photos, the heirlooms, the floral curtains Riley had once called outdated. Everything shimmered in the morning light as if saying goodbye. I packed one suitcase, just essentials. As I closed the door behind me, I took a long breath of the crisp October air. For the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. They wanted me gone. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. And soon, they'd understand what disappearing really meant. The train station was almost empty that morning. I sat on a wooden bench, clutching my single suitcase. The schedule board flickered above me, its lights humming softly. Every sound, the roll of the wheels on concrete, the faint chatter of strangers, felt distant, as if I were listening from underwater. It had been 12 hours since I left my house. 12 hours since I decided to vanish. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe them that. My phone buzzed with notifications I didn't open. Ethan had called 3 times, then stopped. Riley hadn't called at all. The chill from the marble floor crept through my shoes. I rubbed my hands together and looked out the glass doors at the parking lot beyond. A line of orange dawn split the horizon, sharp and cold. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't shaking. The train to Portland arrived with a low whistle. I boarded quietly, found a seat by the window, and watched my town shrink into the distance. By the time the train reached the city, my lawyer, Martin Reynolds, was waiting near the platform. He held a manila folder under one arm, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Are you sure about this, Alice?" he asked as we walked toward his office. I nodded. Completely. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and coffee. The same office where my husband once signed our will 20 years ago. I sat in the same chair he'd used, my hands resting on the cool edge of the desk. Martin opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "The deed is still in your name, as you knew. Selling it would take less than a week if that's what you want." "Yes," I said quietly. "Sell it, and make sure it can't be traced back to them." He studied me for a long moment. "They'll notice quickly. I'm counting on it." He hesitated, then asked, "And the proceeds?" I met his eyes. "Transfer them to my account in cash equivalents. After that, I'll decide." He nodded slowly, signing the papers before sliding them to me. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was small, but it felt enormous. With each stroke, the house, my house, moved further away from them, from her. That evening, I checked into a modest inn near the coast. The clerk didn't ask questions when I handed her my ID. "Just one night?" she asked. "Maybe longer," I said. The room was simple. A twin bed, a lamp with a crooked shade, and a window overlooking the gray ocean. I opened it slightly. The air smelled of salt and rain. I sat on the bed and pulled the photo of Ethan from my purse. He was 10 years old, his front teeth missing, holding a kite we'd built together. His smile in that picture could light a whole street. What had gone wrong between then and now? Was it Riley's influence? Or was it something I'd refused to see? The distance, the quiet resentment that had been growing long before she arrived? I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. "You'll understand someday," I whispered. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, unknown number. I let it ring. 2 days later, Martin called. "The sale's complete," he said. "The payment has cleared. You're officially free of the property." Free. The word didn't sound like I expected. It wasn't light or triumphant. It was heavy, grounded. "What about them?" I asked. He sighed. "I imagine they'll find out soon. The wedding planner called me this morning. Apparently the venue contract was tied to your property as collateral. When the ownership changed hands, the reservation was canceled automatically." I could almost see Riley's face, the way her voice would sharpen when things didn't go her way. "Thank you, Martin," I said. He hesitated again. "Do you want me to send them any message?" I thought for a moment. "Yes. Send them the folder in my desk drawer, the one marked for Ethan and Riley. You'll find it when they break in." There was silence. Then, understood. I spent the next morning walking along the beach. The sky was low and gray, waves sliding over the sand in thin, tired curls. My shoes sank with each step. I didn't mind. The air was cold, but it kept me awake. At the edge of the water, I bent down and picked up a small shell, white and perfect. I turned it in my fingers, thinking of how fragile it looked, and how long it had survived against the tide. In the distance, a child was building a sandcastle. His mother called out to him, laughter in her voice. It made me think of Ethan again, back when he'd run through this same kind of sand, his little hands clutching shells, shouting for me to look. I smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hurt behind the eyes. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. It was just 3 words. "What did you do?" No name, no punctuation. But I knew the sender. I placed the phone face down on the table and continued eating my soup. They'd found out. In another city, in another part of my life, chaos was unfolding. Ethan would be pacing, Riley would be yelling, the wedding planner would be canceling, guests would be confused, the venue locked. I could almost hear her voice. She ruined everything. No, I thought. I just returned everything to its rightful owner. When I woke the next morning, the ocean was calm. The clouds had cleared, revealing a faint stripe of pink light on the horizon. I made coffee using the little machine in the corner of the room. It hissed and sputtered, filling the space with warmth. I sat by the window, watching the waves roll in. In the quiet, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't running away. I wasn't hiding. I had simply stepped out of the story they wrote for me. For years, I'd been the background character, the mother who pays, the widow who nods, the silent spectator. Now I was rewriting the script. A knock at the door startled me. It was the innkeeper, holding a small envelope. "This came for you, Mrs. Edwards," she said. I thanked her, closed the door, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No return address. "Mom, please call me. Riley's gone crazy. We can fix this. Please." Ethan, I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I folded the paper neatly and placed it inside the drawer. Some lessons have to be learned without comfort. That night, I walked back to the beach. The tide was higher, moonlight spilling across the water like silver paint. I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at my coat. I thought about the house, the laughter that once filled it, the meals shared, the arguments, the quiet nights reading by the fire. Every wall carried a memory, and I'd left them all behind without looking back. But maybe that was the only way to start again. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed once more. A photo message. The image loaded slowly. Riley, standing in the empty living room, her face twisted with disbelief. Behind her, the walls bare, the furniture gone. At her feet, a single envelope rested on the floor. The one I'd left for them. She didn't know what was inside yet. I smiled faintly, slipping my phone into my pocket. The ocean roared behind me, and the night swallowed her picture whole. They wanted me to disappear. Now they would finally understand what that really means. The morning after Riley's message, the sky broke open with rain. It came down hard, rattling the window pane of the little inn room. I sat on the edge of the bed, the blanket folded neatly beside me, staring at the phone on the table. It hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Missed calls, voicemails, messages that began with, "How could you?" and ended with, "Please call us back." I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I made myself tea and listened to the sound of the storm. There was something strangely peaceful about it. The chaos outside, the stillness within. It reminded me of the years I'd spent trying to keep calm while everyone else in the house shouted. Riley's voice had always carried the loudest. Now it was silent. By noon, I had checked out of the inn and boarded a bus heading north. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Even Martin didn't know. I just needed distance. Miles between me and the ghosts of that house. Through the bus window, the coastline stretched endlessly. The sea was gray, restless, but beautiful in its defiance. I watched it roll and crash, again and again, as if it were teaching me something about starting over. An older woman sat beside me, knitting a scarf the color of sunshine. After a while, she looked up and smiled. "Heading somewhere new?" "Yes," I said softly. "Somewhere quiet," she nodded. "Quiet can be healing, you know." Her words stayed with me. I arrived in a small town called Willow Point by evening. It wasn't much. A grocery store, a diner, and a handful of cottages lined up near the harbor. I rented one for the month. The owner, a kind man with sea-salted hair, handed me the key. "It's small, but the heater works," he said with a grin. Small was fine. I didn't need space. I needed air. The cottage smelled faintly of pine and old books. There was a single armchair by the window, a wooden table, and a small fireplace stacked with kindling. I unpacked my few things and placed the photograph of Ethan on the shelf. The boy in the picture still smiled at me as if nothing bad could ever happen. That night, I cooked for myself. Simple soup, bread toasted on the stove. I ate by the firelight and let the crackling fill the room. My hands still felt strange without the weight of house keys, without the constant motion of doing things for someone else. Freedom had its own kind of loneliness. After dinner, I opened the envelope Riley had appeared to find in that photo. I had written the note inside days before leaving. I knew by now she must have read it. The message was short. You wished I'd disappear. Consider your wish granted. What you do with the silence I left behind is up to you. No anger. No insult. Just truth. I could almost imagine her expression as she unfolded it. The disbelief. The frustration. The dawning realization that every inch of that house, the one she paraded through as her domain, had never belonged to her at all. 2 days passed quietly. I bought groceries from the local store, chatted with the cashier, walked along the pier when the weather cleared. No one here knew my name. No one knew my story. It was bliss. Until the newspaper arrived. The headline caught my eye. Local wedding scandal. Bride accused of fraud over stolen venue. I didn't need to read the rest, but I did. Riley's name was there, quoted angrily about unfair legal interference. The article mentioned that the wedding had been canceled due to property disputes, financial issues, and miscommunication with the owner. Owner. That word still belonged to me until the day I chose otherwise. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside. There was no satisfaction in their downfall, only a strange hollow calm. They had built their happiness on my generosity, and when the foundation vanished, it all crumbled. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. That afternoon, I received another message from Ethan. Mom, please. I just need to understand. Why did you do this? Riley's furious. She says you ruined her life. I know things were tense, but you didn't have to go this far. I read it twice. Then I replied with only 4 words. You already let her. Then I turned off the phone. That evening, a storm returned. Wind howling, trees bending, the ocean lashing at the shore. I lit a candle and sat near the window, watching lightning flash across the dark water. The world outside looked wild, but I felt still. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what it meant to lose something he'd taken for granted. Maybe in time, he'd understand that my silence wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. I took out my old journal and began to write again. It had been years since I'd put anything down. My husband used to tell me that writing was my way of breathing. He'd be glad to see me doing it again. I wrote about the house, the scent of coffee on Sunday mornings, the laughter that once filled it, the sound of Ethan's footsteps running down the hallway. Then I wrote about the emptiness after he left for college, about how Riley slowly replaced my presence with her control. The comments, the smirks, the quiet exclusion. And finally, the words she said at the rehearsal, the best gift would be if you disappeared from our family. I stopped there, pen hovering above the page. For a moment, the weight of those words returned, pressing on my chest. But it didn't hurt the same way anymore. It was just a sentence, empty air from an empty heart. I closed the journal and whispered to the quiet room, You got your wish, Riley. The next morning, a knock on the door woke me. I opened it to find the innkeeper's daughter, a shy teenager with rainwater dripping from her hair. She held out a small package. Someone left this for you at the post office, she said. The handwriting on the box was familiar. Ethan's. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a framed photo. It was the 3 of us, me, Ethan, and Riley, at their engagement party. I looked younger, lighter. Riley stood between us, smiling like a woman who already owned everything she wanted. There was a note taped to the back. I didn't see what she was doing to you. I'm sorry. I just hope you're safe. For a long time, I stared at that note, unsure if I felt forgiveness or just exhaustion. Then I set the photo face down on the table. Some memories didn't need a frame anymore. By evening, I found myself walking through town again. The sky was clearing, streaked with the soft pinks of sunset. I passed the bakery, the library, the little antique shop that smelled of cedar and dust. Life went on. A stray cat brushed against my leg, meowing softly. I crouched down and scratched its head. You hungry? I asked. The cat blinked slowly as if it understood. I took it home, fed it the leftover chicken from my dinner. It purred against my hand, curling up near the fireplace as if it had always belonged there. Maybe we both needed a new beginning. That night, I lay in bed listening to the faint sound of waves. My phone turned face down on the table, blinked once. Another message waiting, maybe from Ethan, maybe from no one. I didn't look. Instead, I closed my eyes and thought about the house one last time. The laughter, the betrayal, the silence. All of it fading like the echo of a storm that had already passed. I wasn't gone. I was just elsewhere. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreaming of walls. A week passed before I heard from Ethan again. The message came late at night, short and tired. "Mom, I don't know how to fix this. Riley's gone. She left after another fight. She said it's all my fault. Please, can we talk?" I read it twice, then set the phone down beside the lamp. Outside, the waves crashed harder than usual, a storm pushing in from the horizon. I turned off the light and listened. The house creaked softly in the wind, the kind of sound that feels alive when you're alone. He was finally starting to see what she'd done. I didn't respond. Not yet. Sometimes silence teaches more than words ever could. The next morning, I went to the market in town. The air smelled of wet earth and coffee. People greeted each other by name. It was the kind of place where time moved slower. I bought apples, bread, a small jar of honey. The woman at the counter smiled. "New here?" "For now," I said. She nodded as if she understood. Sometimes that's the best way to start. When I got back to the cottage, the cat I'd adopted, who I'd started calling Whiskers, was curled on the window ledge, watching seagulls. I poured a bowl of milk and sat down beside him. The quiet filled every corner of the room. For years, my life had been noise. Arguments behind closed doors, phone calls I wasn't included in, dinners where my presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Now, there was only stillness, and somehow it felt louder than any of it. That evening, I opened my old journal again. I wrote about my husband, Daniel, about how he used to whistle when he worked in the garden, how he'd promised me we'd grow old in that house together. He kept his promise in a way. His ashes were buried beneath the oak tree in the backyard. I realized then that I'd left him behind too. For the first time since I'd left, tears came. They weren't sharp or angry, just soft, quiet, almost grateful. Grateful that he wasn't here to see what our family had become. When they stopped, I poured myself tea and watched the fire burn low. 2 days later, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, Riley's. My hands tightened around the envelope before I even opened it. Inside, the note was scrawled in heavy ink. "You think you've won. You humiliated us. You made him hate me. I hope you're proud of yourself. You destroyed this family. No apology. No remorse. Just venom." I folded the paper once and tossed it into the fireplace. It caught flame instantly, curling into ash. The fire crackled like it was applauding. I whispered to the smoke, "You destroyed it long before I did." That night, I dreamt of the house. In the dream, the walls were white again, the way they were before Riley's renovations. The smell of cinnamon and old books filled the air. Daniel was in the kitchen and humming that same tune he always did when he cooked. Ethan was a boy again, sitting at the table, swinging his legs, asking if he could lick the spoon. I woke with tears on my face and a peace I hadn't felt in years. The past was gone, but at least it was honest in my dreams. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with coffee, watching the sun rise. A car pulled up to the end of the lane. My heart stilled. No one ever came here. Ethan stepped out. He looked thinner, older somehow. His eyes searched the porch until they found me. For a second, he didn't say anything, just stood there, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. I nodded toward the empty chair beside me. "Coffee's still hot." He sat, the wood creaking under his weight. His hands shook slightly as he took the cup I poured. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. "You found the right place," I replied softly. We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the gulls and the wind. Finally, he spoke again. "She's gone for good. Took what money she could and left. I didn't see who she really was until you were gone." I said nothing. He turned to me, voice breaking. "I thought you were being cruel. I thought you wanted to ruin us. But now I see what she did, how she turned me against you." His eyes filled, but he didn't look away. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words landed like rain on dry soil, quiet, heavy, overdue. I didn't reach out to hug him. I just nodded. "That's a start." He stayed the night in the small guest room. I made stew, just like I used to when he was a boy. We didn't talk much, but the silence was different this time. Comfortable. Healing. When he went to bed, I stood by the window, watching the moon rise over the water. Whiskers rubbed against my leg, purring softly. I thought about how easily love turns to pride, and pride to distance. Families don't break all at once. They crack quietly over years, until one day you realize you're standing on opposite sides of the same silence. The next morning, Ethan helped me hang laundry on the line. The wind caught the sheets, making them billow like sails. He looked out toward the sea and said, "I don't think I can go back there. Too many memories." "You don't have to," I said. "Start somewhere else. Just make sure it's yours this time." He smiled faintly. "You sound like Dad." I looked at him for a long moment. Maybe I'm finally remembering how. By afternoon, he was gone. He left me a note on the table before he drove away. "Thank you for disappearing when you did. It made me see who was really missing." I folded it neatly and tucked it into my journal. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a seed of something that might grow. That evening, I walked down to the shore. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath my feet. A gull cried overhead, its sound cutting clean through the air. I watched the horizon turn gold, then violet. The world kept moving, as if it didn't notice the wars that happen inside houses, inside hearts. Maybe that's mercy. I thought of Riley, wherever she was now. Maybe she'd find someone else to fool, or maybe she'd finally see herself clearly. Either way, she was out of my story. I thought of Ethan, driving toward a future I couldn't control. And I thought of Daniel, still under that old oak, the roots wrapping around what was left of him. I whispered into the wind, "It's over now." And for the first time in decades, I believed it. When I went back inside, the fire was still burning. I sat in my chair, whiskers curled beside me, and opened my journal again. On the last page I wrote, "They asked me to disappear, so I did. But what I really did was start living again." I closed the book, placed it on the table, and let the sound of the waves fill the room. Outside, the night settled like a soft blanket over the sea, and the only light left came from the fire. The quiet proof that I was still here. The sea was calm the next morning, a flat sheet of silver stretching to the horizon. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching the sun lift itself slowly over the water. Whiskers rubbed against my ankle, meowing for breakfast. The house smelled of salt, warmth, and something I hadn't felt in years, peace. It had been a month since Ethan's visit. He called once a week now. Not to apologize anymore, but just to talk. He'd found a small apartment in the city, started working again. He sounded different, steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after breaking free. I kept my answers simple. "I'm fine, sweetheart," because I was. Still, when the evenings came and the light faded, I sometimes thought about the years I'd lost, the dinners I wasn't invited to, the holidays spent in silence. How easily a family can fade when respect leaves the room. But I no longer hurt when I thought about it. The pain had turned into distance, and distance had turned into understanding. That afternoon, I walked to the small post office in town. There was a letter waiting for me, sent from a legal firm in the city. The return address made my stomach tighten. It was Martin, my lawyer. Inside was a short note. "Just keeping you informed, Alice. Riley has filed for bankruptcy. There are also pending fraud investigations related to her business accounts. You might be contacted for verification, but I'll handle the details." At the bottom, he'd added in his neat handwriting, "P.S. You were right to step away when you did." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my bag. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain. A storm was coming again. For a long moment, I stood there on the road watching the dark clouds gather over the sea. I didn't feel pity for her. I didn't feel triumph either. Some storms you bring upon yourself. Back at the cottage, I lit the fire and made soup. The rhythm of small things kept me grounded. The scrape of the spoon against the pot, the soft sound of wood crackling, the cat's gentle snore from the corner. I thought about how much time I'd spent doing grand things for people who never noticed. Now, the smallest act felt sacred. I remembered something Daniel once said after a fight we had in our early years of marriage. "You give too much, Alice, and then you resent people for taking it. You have to leave something for yourself." I hadn't understood it then, but I did now. Every breath, every quiet moment by the fire, every step on the sand, it was something I'd kept for myself. Finally. A knock on the door startled me just as the rain began to fall. I opened it to see a woman standing there, soaked to the bone, her car parked crookedly at the end of the drive. "Sorry," she said breathlessly. "My car died a mile back. The innkeeper said you might have a phone I could use." She was around 40, maybe younger, her eyes tired but kind. I nodded. "Come in, before you freeze." She stepped inside, dripping onto the rug. "I'm Laura," she said, holding out her hand. "I just moved to town." "Alice," I replied, shaking it. As she called the local mechanic, I poured her tea and handed her one of my old sweaters. She smiled, grateful, the way strangers do when the world has been rough. When she hung up, she noticed the framed picture of Ethan on the shelf. "Your son?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "He looks a lot like my brother. He passed away last year." I nodded softly. "Loss changes us." "It does," she said, eyes glistening, "but sometimes it opens room for better things." We sat together in silence, two women from different storms finding warmth in the same fire. When the mechanic arrived, she thanked me again. "You've got a good heart," she said at the door. "I can feel it." After she left, I realized I hadn't heard that in years. The next few weeks passed quietly. Laura stopped by often, sometimes with pastries, sometimes just to sit by the fire and talk about everything and nothing. She had her own wounds, a failed marriage and estranged family, but she laughed easily, like someone who had decided pain would not own her. One afternoon, she asked about my past. "What made you move here?" I hesitated, staring into my cup of tea. "I suppose I finally understood that being invisible was not the same as being at peace." She smiled softly. "And now?" "Now," I said, "I don't mind being unseen, as long as I can still see the sea." She laughed, and for the first time, so did I. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I received another letter, this time from Ethan. Inside was a small photo, him standing in front of a modest new home. Behind him, a garden half planted, a smile that looked almost like the boy I remembered. On the back, he'd written, "I'm building something honest this time. You'd like it here." I ran my thumb over the image, the edges warm from my hands. Then I placed it beside the picture of Daniel, where it belonged. Later that night, the rain returned. I sat by the fire with whiskers in my lap, listening to the rhythm against the windows. The reflection of the flames danced on the glass, soft and golden. I thought about everything that had happened, the cruelty, the silence, the breaking and rebuilding. I thought about how I'd once believed disappearing was the end. But it had only been the beginning. Some people learn through love, others through loss, and some of us through the echo of both. Before going to bed, I stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the world shining and wet. The air smelled of pine and ocean. The moonlight stretched across the water like a promise. I whispered into the night, "You'd like it here, Daniel." A single wave rolled in, touched the shore, and slipped away again. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt answered. The next morning, I found a letter under my door. It was from Laura. She'd written, "Dinner at my place tonight? Nothing fancy, just good soup and company. I think you've been alone long enough." I smiled as I read it. The ink was smudged, the handwriting uneven. Real. Human. That evening, I walked down the hill toward her cottage. Lights glowed warmly through her window, and I could hear faint laughter from inside. It reminded me of something I'd lost, and something I was ready to find again. When she opened the door, she hugged me before saying a word. The smell of garlic and fresh bread filled the air. We ate, talked, and laughed until the candles burned low. When I returned home that night, the house didn't feel as quiet. Before going to sleep, I wrote one last page in my journal. Forgiveness isn't about letting them back in. It's about stepping out of the pain and into the light. I thought I'd lost my family, but I just hadn't met the right one yet. I closed the book, placed it beside the bed, and blew out the candle. The waves whispered beyond the window, steady and sure. I lay there listening, heart steady, eyes closed, the kind of peace that doesn't ask for anything. The house, the wedding, the betrayal, it all felt like another lifetime. And maybe, in some way, it was. The weeks blended softly into each other, like watercolor bleeding on paper. Life had found its rhythm again. Quiet mornings, coffee by the sea, walks through the market, letters from Ethan every few days. He wrote about work, about the garden behind his house, about how the silence at night used to feel heavy until he started planting trees. "I think I finally get it," one letter said. "The peace you wanted. It's not loneliness, it's breathing." I smiled when I read that. He was learning. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my journal. The cottage smelled of lavender from the sachets Laura had brought last week. Whiskers sprawled in the sunbeam near the door, his tail flicking lazily. Everything was small, but everything was enough. One morning, Laura stopped by with a basket of fresh vegetables. "Farmer's Market Hall," she said proudly. "You're cooking tonight." I laughed softly. "I suppose I owe you dinner." She grinned. "That's the spirit." We cooked together, our hands moving easily around each other in the small kitchen. She chopped tomatoes while I stirred soup, and the air filled with the scent of basil and garlic. We didn't talk much, just small things. The kind of conversation that feels like background music. Halfway through dinner, she looked up suddenly. "You seem lighter lately," she said, "like something finally let go." I thought about it. "Maybe I did," I said quietly. "Maybe I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come." Laura nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "That's how healing starts. You stop needing them to understand." Her words sank deep, like pebbles dropped in still water. That night, after she left, I sat by the fire with a cup of tea. I hadn't noticed before how full my life had become again. Letters, laughter, soup shared between friends. Not grand things, but real ones. Still, part of me wondered if Ethan would ever visit again. The last time we saw each other, he'd been fragile, but trying. I missed his presence. The boy who used to fix the leaky faucet without being asked. The man who'd finally learned how to say "I'm sorry" and mean it. I thought of calling him, then didn't. Some things take time to grow back. A few days later, I received another envelope. It wasn't from Ethan or Martin this time. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, careful. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Mrs. Edwards, my name is Margaret. I'm Riley's mother. I know what my daughter did, and I'm ashamed. She's in a difficult place now. She asked me not to contact you, but I needed to say this. I wish I had raised her better. I hope you find peace." The letter ended there. No address, no signature beyond her name. I sat for a long time holding it, the firelight flickering across the page. I should have felt anger, or maybe satisfaction. But instead I felt something unexpected, sadness. Not for Riley, but for the mother who had to write that letter. Because I knew what it was to love a child who lost their way. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Ethan's letters. Not forgiveness, but understanding. That was enough. The next morning, I walked along the beach. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath my feet. A group of children were flying kites near the dunes, their laughter cutting through the wind. For a moment I saw Ethan in their faces, the same reckless joy, the same light. I sat on a driftwood log, letting the wind tangle my hair. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the ocean fill everything. When I opened them again, I noticed something half buried in the sand, a piece of sea glass, smooth and pale green. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm, once sharp, now soft. The sea had done its work. People aren't much different, I thought. Time smooths even the cruelest edges. That afternoon, Laura came by again. "You missed church," she teased, setting down a basket of muffins. "I was at my own sermon," I said, "delivered by the ocean." She laughed, sitting across from me. "And what did the ocean say?" I looked out the window, watching the horizon fade into mist. It said that letting go doesn't mean losing. It means making space. Laura nodded thoughtfully. "You should write that down. Might save someone else a few years of pain." I smiled. Maybe I already did. Later that week, Ethan called. His voice was calm, steady. "Mom, I've been thinking there's a property near my new job, a small one, big enough for 2 gardens. I thought maybe someday you might want to move closer." I didn't answer right away. The fire crackled softly beside me. Whiskers lifted his head as if listening too. "Someday," I said, "when the seas had enough of me." He chuckled quietly. "So, never?" "Maybe never," I said. "But I'm glad you asked." Before hanging up, he said, "You taught me more by leaving than you ever could by staying." After he hung up, I sat in the silence for a long time, watching the embers glow. That night, a storm rolled in, one of those fierce coastal tempests that make the windows shake. The power went out, leaving only the fire for light. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat near it, listening to the wind howl through the trees. For a moment, I imagined the house back in the city. The walls Riley painted gray, the chandelier she insisted on buying, the emptiness that must fill it now. I wondered if she still dreamt of that perfect wedding that never happened, or if she finally realized what she'd broken wasn't mine. It was hers. I whispered to the dark, "May she find the peace she denied me." The wind answered with a soft sigh through the chimney. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean. Branches littered the sand, and the air smelled of renewal. I made breakfast, just eggs and toast, and ate it slowly by the window. The sunlight fell across the table, golden and warm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's story. I was the author again. That afternoon, I met Laura in town for coffee. The cafe windows were fogged from the steam, and the chatter of locals filled the room. We found a corner table and talked about everything except the past. When we were leaving, she stopped me at the door. "You know," she said, "you've become a bit of a legend around here. The woman who sold her house and vanished before her son's wedding." I raised an eyebrow. "Legend or cautionary tale?" She grinned. "Depends on who's telling it. But if you ask me, it's a story about freedom." I laughed softly. "Then I suppose I'm fine with that." That night, I sat on the porch as the sun melted into the sea. The horizon glowed orange, the air still warm from the day. I thought about everything that had happened, the cruelty, the loss, the slow rebuilding, all the versions of myself that had existed along the way. I whispered to the wind, "Thank you for breaking me just enough to see clearly." Whiskers curled beside my feet, purring in agreement. The sky darkened, the stars began to appear, and somewhere in the distance, the tide rolled in again, steady, patient, eternal. And I knew finally that I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I was home. The next morning, the air smelled of rain and pine, the kind of morning that feels like a clean page. I brewed coffee, poured it into my chipped blue mug, and stepped outside to the porch. The sea stretched endlessly before me, calm and silver under the soft light. It had been almost 6 months since I'd left everything behind. 6 months since I sold the house, disappeared, and chose silence over chaos. And somehow, that silence had turned into peace. Ethan's letters came less often now, but they were steady, like a heartbeat. He was busy, working, living, learning to cook for himself. Every line he wrote sounded more like the boy I'd raised. I didn't need daily proof that he was okay. Sometimes loving someone means trusting the distance between you. By mid-morning, Laura arrived with a smile and a box of pastries. "You can't live on coffee alone," she scolded gently. "I have Whiskers," I said, nodding toward the cat stretched on the porch railing. "He shares my meals," she laughed. "I'm sure he does. But I brought cinnamon rolls, so move over." We sat together, the ocean breeze curling the steam off our cups. For a while, we didn't talk. That's the thing about real friendship. It doesn't need to fill the silence. It just lives inside it. After a while, she asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" I looked out at the sea. "Back to what? There's nothing left to return to." She nodded, understanding. "Still, I think you should see it one day. Not for them, for yourself." I didn't answer. But that night, her words followed me into sleep. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from Martin, my lawyer. Inside were several documents and a letter in his familiar handwriting. "Alice, I thought you should know. The house sale is finalized, all proceedings complete. The property has been demolished for redevelopment. The new owners requested your contact only to thank you for your efficiency. It's all gone now, cleanly and legally. Thought you'd want closure." Closure. I read the word again. It felt strange, final yet freeing. The house that once held my life, my pain, my husband's memory, even my betrayal, it was dust now. The oak tree in the backyard was probably gone too. But the memories of him, of who we were, they still lived in me. I folded the papers and placed them in the drawer with Ethan's letters. I didn't cry, not even a little. Maybe that was what closure really meant. That evening, Laura and I walked along the shore as the tide came in. The sky blushed orange and pink, gulls wheeling overhead. "I got news today," I told her. "The house is gone." She stopped walking, looking at me. "And how does that feel?" I smiled faintly. "Like the last ghost finally left me alone." She nodded. "Then it's time to build something new." That night, I dreamed of Daniel again. He was standing by the old oak, sunlight flickering through the leaves. He turned to me and said, "You did what you had to do." When I woke, the air felt lighter. I made tea and sat at the window, watching the dawn creep in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by what I'd lost. I felt thankful for what had survived. A few days later, Ethan called. His voice sounded brighter than usual. "Mom, I've been offered a promotion. I wanted to tell you first." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said. He hesitated. "There's one more thing. I met someone." I smiled into the phone. "Oh? She's kind, real, the opposite of everything I used to chase. I wanted you to know because I don't ever want to hide anything from you again." My chest warmed. "I'm happy for you, Ethan. Truly." He paused, his tone softening. "I learned what love isn't. Now I think I'm ready to learn what it is." I could almost see him smiling through the line. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, staring at the horizon, whispering, "You finally grew up, my boy." Spring came to Willow Point slowly. Flowers began to bloom along the dunes, painting the coast with color. I started tending a small garden behind the cottage, lavender, rosemary, and a few wildflowers that reminded me of home. Every morning, I'd water them, hum softly, and talk to Daniel's memory like he was still there beside me. "See?" I'd whisper. "We built a new garden after all." Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling for no reason. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in a vase, there was a knock at the door. It was the postman with a small package. No return address, just my name. Inside was a framed photo, Ethan standing in front of his garden, his arm around a woman I didn't know. Beneath it was a small note. "For you, Mom. I planted lavender. It's growing." My throat tightened. I placed the photo on the mantel, next to Daniel's old wedding ring, and whispered, "It's growing here, too." That evening, Laura stopped by for tea. She noticed the photo and smiled. "He looks happy," she said. "He is," I replied. "And that's enough for me." She poured herself a cup and leaned back. "You know, Alice, you've become the calmest woman I know. Nothing rattles you anymore." I chuckled. "When you've lived through storms, drizzle doesn't scare you." We laughed, the sound warm and full, filling the little cottage until it felt like home. Later that night, after she left, I stepped outside. The moon hung low over the sea, silver light spilling across the waves. Whiskers followed me to the porch, his tail brushing my leg. I whispered into the night, I did disappear, just like she asked, but in doing so, I found myself again. The tide rolled in softly as if agreeing. Before going to bed, I opened my journal one last time for the day and wrote, "They thought silence was surrender, but silence was where I rebuilt my strength. The woman who left her home was broken. The woman who lives by the sea is free." I closed the journal, set it beside the lamp, and blew out the light. Outside, the waves whispered against the shore, steady and endless, like a promise that life, no matter how shattered, always finds its rhythm again. And somewhere in that rhythm, I finally heard myself breathing without pain. The summer light came earlier now, slipping through the thin curtains before I even opened my eyes. The days had grown long and golden, filled with the hum of bees and the soft crash of the tide against the rocks. I woke every morning to the sound of the sea and the faint rustle of whiskers pawing at the door. I poured my coffee and stepped outside. The air smelled of salt and wildflowers. My garden had become something of a small miracle. Lavender blooming in thick clusters, rosemary spilling over the edges, tiny white daisies popping up where I hadn't planted them. The world didn't ask much of me anymore, and that was the greatest gift. By mid-morning, Laura arrived as she always did, her straw hat slightly crooked and a jar of honey in her hands. "From the beekeeper up the hill," she said. "He says it's the good kind, made with patience." I smiled. "Then it'll fit right in here." She looked around the garden, her eyes soft. "You've done something beautiful, Alice. You've built peace with your own hands." I nodded, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "Peace isn't built once. You build it every day, and some days you have to rebuild it from nothing." She grinned. "That sounds like something I'd stitch on a pillow." "Don't you dare," I said, and we both laughed. That evening, the mailman dropped off another letter from Ethan. His handwriting had changed, more confident, less rushed. I sat by the window and read it slowly, the sea breeze moving through the open curtains. "Mom, she's met you in my stories for months now. Her name is Lily. She knows what happened and she understands. We're not rushing anything. But if there ever comes a day when you'd be ready to meet her, we'd both love that." I reread that line several times. There was no pressure in his words, only openness. For a long time, I stared at the ocean, the letter resting in my lap. My reflection in the window looked older, yes, but not tired. I whispered, Maybe I'm ready for that. Days passed quietly after that. I wrote back to Ethan, telling him how proud I was, not just for moving on, but for learning gentleness. I told him about the garden, about Laura, about how the sea had become my clock. At the end, I added one line: "Bring her when the lavender blooms next year. There will be enough peace here for all of us." When I sealed the envelope, I felt something shift inside me, a small release, like an old door finally closing on its hinges. Weeks later, a storm came out of nowhere. The wind howled across the coast, bending the trees and flattening the flowers. Rain hammered against the windows. I sat inside, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the world blur through streaks of water. The power flickered and went out, leaving the cottage bathed in the glow of the fireplace. Whiskers hid beneath the chair, his tail puffed up. I whispered to him, "It's only noise, old boy. Just noise." As the storm raged, I thought of all the storms I'd lived through, those that came with wind and thunder, and those that came in whispers and betrayal. This one was easier, because now I knew how to wait it out. By morning, the storm had passed. The garden was a mess, petals scattered everywhere, one of the planters knocked over, but nothing was truly broken. I stepped outside barefoot, the ground cool and damp beneath me. The sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I began to pick up the fallen branches, shaking the rain off the lavender stalks. The scent rose around me, sweet, steady, forgiving. Laura came by later that afternoon, holding an umbrella, though the sun was already back. "You okay?" she asked. "I am," I said. "Everything's still standing." She smiled, "Including you." That evening, we had dinner together. Two women who'd both been through their own wreckage, sitting in a kitchen that smelled of soup and rain. She told me about her daughter, who was finally visiting after years apart. I told her about Ethan's new life. Somewhere between laughter and quiet, we both realized we weren't lonely anymore. A few days later, a small envelope arrived from Martin. Inside was a simple form and a note that read, "I took care of the last paperwork. Your name is officially removed from all prior property records. Everything that tied you to that past, legally or otherwise, is done." At the bottom, he'd added, "You've closed the book cleanly, Alice." I placed the letter beside the others, then took out my old photo albums, the ones I hadn't opened in years. There were pictures of Ethan as a baby, Daniel holding him in the yard, me in the kitchen with flour on my nose. I ran my fingers over them one by one, smiling softly. "I kept the good parts," I whispered. "That's enough." Then I slid the album shut and put it back on the shelf. The next morning, I met Laura at the cafe. She was already there, sipping tea, the sunlight catching in her silver hair. "You're glowing," she said as I sat down. "I cleaned out the ghosts," I replied. She chuckled. "Good." I was starting to think they'd taken up rent. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. Plans for summer, a trip to the next town's fair, maybe starting a small market stall with our homemade goods. For the first time in a long time, I caught myself making plans for the future, not the past. That night, as the sun disappeared into the horizon, I stood on the porch and watched the sky bleed into gold and violet. The sea shimmered like liquid glass. I whispered, "Daniel, you'd be proud of him. Of us. Of me." The wind brushed past, soft as a sigh. Whiskers jumped onto the railing beside me, his eyes following the waves. I stroked his fur and smiled. "You and I said softly. "We weathered it all." Later, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. The pages smelled faintly of salt and ash. I wrote, "The storms don't scare me anymore. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the refusal to be owned by it. I disappeared once, but I didn't vanish. I only made room to be found by myself." I closed the journal and left it open on the table, a candle burning beside it. Outside, the night was still, the sea breathing in slow, eternal rhythm. I could hear the faint call of gulls somewhere in the distance, the whisper of waves against the shore. And for the first time, I didn't just feel alive. I felt whole. The first chill of autumn came quietly, carried on a breeze that smelled of pine and the faint smoke from distant chimneys. The mornings were crisp now, the kind that made my coffee steam curl like breath in the cold air. I'd taken to sitting on the porch, wrapped in my old wool shawl, listening to the sea as it shifted moods beneath the gray sky. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Every sound, every silence had its place. Even Whiskers seemed slower now, spending most of his time curled in the armchair by the fire, dreaming of something beyond his small world. But peace has a way of testing you when you start to believe it's permanent. One afternoon, I received a letter that felt heavier than paper should. The return address was a law office I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it must be some mistake, but when I opened it, the words pulled the air from my lungs. Mrs. Edwards, we regret to inform you that Riley Walters has passed away. You were listed as her next of kin for the purposes of notification. We understand there was estrangement, but certain personal effects were left with instructions to be offered to you. Please advise. The page trembled in my hands. I read it again, slower this time, trying to find feeling, but there was none. Just a hollow space where once years ago, fury had burned. Riley was gone. That evening, I walked to the beach. The waves were dark and restless, foaming at the edges like they carried something unspoken. I watched them for a long time, the letter folded in my pocket. What was I supposed to feel? Relief? Regret? Nothing fit. She had wished me gone once, and I had given her that wish. But now she was the one who had truly disappeared. I thought of her last words, the ones in that angry letter she'd sent months after I left. You destroyed this family. No, I thought. You destroyed yourself. But even that truth didn't bring satisfaction. Only a quiet kind of sorrow for what could never be repaired. A few days later, another envelope arrived, smaller, with no note. Just a key inside. I recognized it immediately. It was the spare house key to the old home, the one I'd kept on my keychain until the day I sold it. There was a small tag attached to it with her handwriting. You left this behind. I think it was always yours. For a moment, my knees almost gave out. I sat down at the table, the key heavy in my palm. After everything, after the cruelty, the betrayal, the silence, she had still kept this. Maybe that was her apology, late but real. That night, I lit a candle and placed the key beside it. The flame flickered gently, reflecting off the worn brass. I whispered into the quiet room, I forgive you. Not because she deserved it, but because I did. The weight that left my chest was almost physical. In the days that followed, I found myself writing more. The journal filled quickly with memories, good ones, bad ones, the spaces in between. I wrote about Daniel's steady hands, Ethan's laughter as a child, the warmth of the old kitchen, the silence that used to ache like a wound. But when I wrote about Riley, I didn't write about her cruelty. I wrote about the young woman who once smiled nervously the first time she met me, holding flowers she'd probably bought with her last paycheck. The one who, for a while, tried to belong. People change. Sometimes they just forget who they wanted to be. One morning, Ethan called. His voice was different, lower, careful. Mom, I thought you should know before you read it anywhere. Riley passed away last week. I know, I said softly. They sent me a letter. There was silence on the line. Then, I didn't think they would. She didn't have anyone else left. I figured as much. He hesitated. I don't know how to feel. I know, I said. You don't have to decide yet. We talked for a long time, mostly pauses. Sometimes silence says everything. Before hanging up, he said, I'm glad you're still here. That one sentence settled into my chest like a balm. After the call, I walked into the garden. The lavender was fading now, brown at the tips, but still fragrant when brushed by my fingers. The sea beyond was calm, endless, steady. I took the key Riley had sent and buried it beneath one of the lavender bushes. A small act, but a final one. Stay there, I whispered. You're part of the earth now, not the house. The wind carried the scent upward, and for the first time I felt that everything was truly finished. That evening, Laura came over for supper. She noticed the candle still burning on the table. Something on your mind? Just closing old doors, I said with a small smile. She nodded, understanding without asking. That's the kind of friendship we'd built. Quiet knowing. We ate in peace, the fire crackling softly, the world beyond our window dark and forgiving. As the days grew shorter, I began to sort through old things, papers, photos, small relics of another life. I found a letter Daniel had written to me the year before he died. I'd forgotten about it. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. If you ever find yourself lost, remember, forgiveness isn't for them, Alice. It's for you, so you can walk without chains. I smiled through tears. You always knew before I did. The next morning I took a long walk along the shoreline. The sand was cold under my bare feet. Each wave that touched my ankles felt like the world breathing. I thought of everything that had happened, the cruelty, the loss, the loneliness, the rebuilding, and beneath it all, a thread of grace that had somehow held me together. When I turned back toward the cottage, I realized something simple. I had survived without bitterness, and that was the quiet victory no one could take away. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal again. The candle's flame danced, steady and soft. I wrote, "She wanted me to disappear, and I did. But I returned as something else, not her victim, not her rival, just a woman who found peace where pain used to live." Then I closed the book, laid my pen on top, and blew out the candle. The room fell into darkness, except for the faint silver glow of moonlight spilling through the window. Outside, the sea kept its rhythm, whispering against the shore, endless, patient, forgiving. And somewhere in that sound, I could almost hear Daniel's voice again, saying what I already knew in my bones. It was over, and I was finally free. The mornings were colder now. I could see my breath when I stepped out onto the porch, the mug of coffee warming my hands while the wind tangled my gray hair. The sea had turned darker, heavier, its rhythm slower, like an old heart still beating out of habit. The lavender was gone for the season, the garden stripped to bone and soil. I didn't mind. Everything has its time to rest. Even me. The letter from Ethan came that afternoon. His handwriting was hurried, but the words carried warmth. "Mom, Lily and I are getting married. It'll be small, nothing like before. Just us, a few friends, and peace. I'd love for you to be there. You don't have to say yes, but I wanted to ask anyway." I sat for a long time with that letter in my lap. My eyes traced the ink until it blurred. Another wedding. Another chance to be tested by the ghosts of the past. I read it again, slower this time, then folded it neatly and pressed it against my chest. He had built a new life, one made of quiet truth instead of noise, and he wanted me to see it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the windows, the same sound that used to keep me awake in the old house, but now it didn't scare me. It only reminded me that I was still here, still standing. By morning, I'd made my decision. 2 weeks later, I took the train north. The same route I'd taken the day I disappeared. The same hum of steel against track, the same endless blur of pine trees rushing by. But this time, I wasn't running away. I was returning as someone different. When I arrived, Ethan was waiting at the station. His eyes lit up the second he saw me. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. He hugged me tight, and for a moment I forgot every year that had stood between us. "I didn't think you'd come," he whispered. "I almost didn't," I said, pulling back to look at him. But then I remembered what it felt like when I stayed away, and I realized I didn't want that anymore. He smiled, eyes wet. "Lily can't wait to meet you." The ceremony was simple. A small chapel by the water, sunlight spilling through the old stained glass. There were no photographers, no speeches, no grand gestures, just two people promising each other something real. I sat in the second row, next to a vase of white lilies that smelled like morning rain. When the music started, I closed my eyes for a moment. The sound of footsteps on wood, the murmur of vows. It should have hurt. It should have taken me back to that other wedding that never happened. But it didn't. It felt like something had been rewritten. Lily looked beautiful. Not because of her dress, but because of her gentleness. When she reached Ethan, she looked at him like he was the only person in the world. And when they turned toward me after saying their vows, she smiled. A soft, knowing smile that said she understood everything that came before. After the ceremony, she came over and hugged me. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "He needed this. You both did." I nodded. "So did you." That evening, we gathered by the water behind the chapel. The tide rolled in soft waves, the sun melting into gold. Ethan built a small fire, and the three of us sat in its glow, eating simple food, talking like old friends instead of people bound by blood and regret. At one point, Ethan handed me a folded envelope. "I found this while moving," he said. "It's from Dad. I think he meant for you to have it." My heart stumbled. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, yellowed with time. "Alice, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye properly. But you always were the strong one. Promise me you won't let the world make you smaller. Promise me you'll find a way to keep living. even when everything hurts. The firelight shimmered across the page. For a moment I saw Daniel's face, the way he used to look at me when life still felt easy. I folded the letter and whispered, "I did, Daniel. I promise. I did." Later, after Ethan and Lily left for the night, I stayed by the fire until the stars came out. The water reflected the sky, dark and infinite. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The cruelty, the silence, the loss, the rediscovery. Every wound had turned into a doorway. I pulled out the small journal I carried and wrote, "You can vanish from a house, but never from love. The family that betrayed me no longer exists. The family I have now was born from the ashes of truth. Sometimes the only way home is through ruin." The ink smudged where a tear fell, but I didn't wipe it away. The next morning, I woke early and walked to the beach before anyone else was awake. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath my feet. I bent down and drew a circle in the wet sand with my finger. Inside it, I wrote one word, peace. When the waves rolled in, they washed it away. But that was the point. Peace isn't something you keep, it's something you live. I turned back toward the chapel, the wind brushing my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. By afternoon, I was back on the train heading home. The fields rushed by outside the window, golden and endless. Across from me, a young couple sat holding hands, whispering secrets that made them laugh quietly. I smiled without meaning to. When the train slowed near the coast, I could see the faint shimmer of the sea in the distance. My sea. My quiet life waiting for me like an old friend. I leaned my head against the glass and closed my eyes. In my mind, I heard Riley's voice again. Not cruel this time, just distant. "The best gift would be if you disappeared." And I whispered back, "I did, and it saved me." When I reached the cottage, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The chair by the fire, the half-read book, the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. Whiskers greeted me at the door with a yawn. I set my suitcase down and lit the fire. The room glowed warm and soft, wrapping itself around me like memory. I poured tea, sat in my chair, and let the quiet settle. Outside, the ocean was calm, steady, endless. I thought of Ethan's wedding, of Daniel's letter, of every chapter that had broken me only to teach me how to stand again. And then, in the stillness, I whispered the last truth I had left. Peace isn't what they give you after you've been good. It's what you take back after they've tried to destroy you. The fire popped gently. The sea hummed its low song beyond the window, and I smiled, softly, completely without a single trace of bitterness left in my heart. I was no longer the woman who disappeared. I was the woman who returned whole. The days after the wedding passed quietly. The house felt fuller, somehow, though I lived alone. The air still held traces of laughter, the kind that lingers after something good has happened. I found myself smiling at nothing, catching the echo of Ethan's voice in the waves, hearing Lily's soft laugh in the wind that moved through the garden. Peace didn't come as a thunderclap. It settled, slow and steady, like dust after a long storm. Every morning I woke before dawn, brewed my coffee, and stepped outside as the first light crawled across the horizon. The world always looks different when you stop fighting it. One afternoon, I sat by the window with my journal open. The last pages were nearly filled. Stories of loss, rediscovery, small miracles. I'd written every word as if it were a heartbeat, but that day, my pen hesitated. What else was left to say? I closed the book and let my gaze wander to the sea. It shimmered under the sun, endless and patient. Maybe, I thought, it was time to start a new one. Laura came by that evening, carrying a basket of apples from the orchard outside town. "They're sweeter this year," she said, setting them on the counter. "Nature's apology for everything else, maybe." I laughed. "Then I forgive it." She leaned against the counter, watching me with that half-smile of hers. "You've changed," she said. "When I met you, you were like a glass about to crack. Now you're still glass, but tempered." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that your poetic way of saying I'm old?" "It's my way of saying you're strong," she replied. "And that kind of strength doesn't come cheap." We shared apple pie later, watching the light fade through the windows. The sky burned gold and violet, and for the first time in a long time, I realized the sunset didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like proof that I'd made it through every kind of dark. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from worry, but from thought. I lit a candle and sat at my desk, pulling out an old stack of letters. Ethan's, Daniel's, even Riley's final note with the house key. I read them one by one. Every word carried a different version of me. The mother, the widow, the woman who disappeared, the one who returned. And somewhere in those pages I found all the versions of myself I'd ever needed. I whispered into the candlelight, "Thank you for leaving. Thank you for returning." The flame flickered, as if it agreed. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened, the town grew quieter, the tourists gone, leaving behind the locals and the rhythm of the sea. I started volunteering at the small library near the pier. Laura had nudged me into it. "They need someone to read stories to the children," she'd said. The first day, I stood in front of half a dozen small faces, their eyes wide, hands sticky with salt and candy. I opened a worn book and began to read. At first, my voice trembled, unused to speaking so much. But then the words took shape, floating into the air like something familiar and true. The children leaned closer, their laughter rising at the funny parts, their eyes softening at the sad ones. When I finished, one little girl looked up and asked, "Was that a true story?" I smiled. All good stories are, in their own way. Walking home afterward, I realized something. I hadn't just found peace. I'd found purpose again. One chilly morning, I got a call from Ethan. "Mom," he said, his voice light with joy, "Lily's expecting." For a moment I couldn't speak. My hand covered my mouth, my heart swelling with something I hadn't felt in years. "A grandchild," I whispered. He laughed softly. "You sound surprised." "I'm surprised by how much it still feels like magic," I said. He told me the due date, how Lily had been craving strawberries even though it was winter, how he'd been nervous and excited all at once. Before hanging up, he said, "I want them to know you, Mom. I want them to grow up hearing your stories." I smiled through tears. "Then tell them everything, Ethan. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." After the call, I walked down to the beach. The tide was low, the sky pale blue. I carried a small seashell I'd found months ago, the same pale green as the sea glass I'd once kept. I buried it near the lavender bush, where Riley's key rested beneath the soil. Life and loss, side by side. That's how it always was. I closed my eyes and whispered a blessing into the wind, for what was broken and what was rebuilt. The air felt softer afterward, as if something invisible had finally forgiven me too. That evening, I sat by the fire and opened a new journal. The first page was blank and waiting. I wrote slowly, deliberately. I used to think revenge meant taking something back. Now I know peace means letting go without losing yourself. I disappeared once, but not because I was weak. I disappeared so I could return stronger, quieter, and free. I paused, then added, "The world didn't change when I came back. I did. And that's enough." The next day, Laura came over again. She brought fabric and scissors, saying she wanted to make something for the baby. I helped her cut pieces for a quilt, soft blues, pale yellows, small squares of white with tiny stars printed on them. We sewed side by side, our hands moving in rhythm, the sound of the needle punctuating the silence. When we finished the first row, she looked at me. "You're going to be a wonderful grandmother." I smiled, my throat tight. "Maybe. But I think this time, I'll be the kind who listens more than she fixes." "Then you'll be perfect," she said. That night, as I walked her to the door, the moon hung low over the water, round and gold. "Do you ever miss who you were before everything?" she asked suddenly. I looked out at the sea. "Sometimes. But mostly I'm grateful I survived her." She nodded, and we said goodnight. When the house was quiet again, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a cup of tea. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and salt. Whiskers curled beside me, purring softly. I thought of all the women like me, the ones who gave too much, endured too much, and then one day decided that disappearing wasn't surrender, but rebirth. To them, to myself, I whispered, "We're still here, and we made it." The tide rolled in slowly, brushing against the rocks. The stars shimmered above, endless and kind, and I felt something I hadn't in a long, long time. Joy, simple and quiet, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a soft light across the room. I picked up the quilt pieces we'd sewn and laid them across my lap. The pattern wasn't perfect. Some corners didn't quite meet, but it was warm and real, stitched with care and time. Like my life. I smiled, running my fingers across the fabric, and whispered to the flames, "This is what healing looks like." The wind outside sighed through the trees, the sea hummed its endless lullaby, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to end. I was exactly where I was meant to be. Winter came slow to the coast. The mornings were pale and still, the sky stretched in shades of silver and blue. Frost touched the edges of the window panes, and each breath I took left a ghost of mist in the cold air. The sea, though, she never slept. Even when the world froze, she kept moving, whispering to the shore like an old friend who couldn't bear silence. I sat by the fire most mornings now, whiskers curled beside my feet, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The garden outside was bare, the lavender cut down to its roots, waiting for spring. I knew how that felt, quiet on the surface, but alive underneath. It had been nearly a year since Ethan's wedding. The days slipped by gently, one folding into the next. Letters came less often now, replaced by phone calls and photos. Lily's growing belly, the nursery painted soft green, Ethan grinning beside a crib he'd built himself. Every image felt like sunlight through glass. One evening, as snow began to fall, my phone rang. I answered, already smiling. "Mom," Ethan's voice trembled with something bright. "She's here." For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "She?" "Our daughter," he said. "You have a granddaughter. Her name's Grace." The world seemed to pause. The fire crackled, the snow fell heavier, and I pressed the phone to my heart. "Grace," I whispered. "Of course it is." A month later, I took the train again. I carried only a small suitcase and a knitted blanket I'd made from scraps of old yarn, blues and whites, soft like the sky before dawn. When I stepped off the train, Ethan was waiting, just as he had a year before, but this time his arms were full of something tiny and swaddled. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking into a laugh. "Meet Grace." He placed her in my arms, and the world grew impossibly still. Her skin was soft, her tiny fingers curling around one of mine with a strength that made my heart ache. She blinked up at me, eyes wide and calm, and in that gaze I saw every generation that had come before. Every hurt, every forgiveness, every moment that had led to this one. "She's beautiful," I whispered. "She looks like you," Lily said from beside him. Her voice was gentle, honest. I smiled, brushing a fingertip across Grace's cheek. "Then she'll be stubborn." They both laughed softly, and for a while, none of us spoke. The snow outside the station fell in slow spirals, covering the world in quiet. They took me home with them. A small house tucked near the edge of town, with yellow curtains and a faint scent of vanilla. Lily made tea while Ethan showed me the nursery. Every detail was thoughtful. A rocking chair by the window, a quilt draped across the crib. On the wall hung a framed photo of the sea at sunset, the one I'd taken from my cottage porch. "I wanted her to have a piece of where she came from," Ethan said quietly. I turned to him. "You remembered?" He nodded, eyes soft. "That place saved you. Maybe it'll remind her what peace looks like." That night, after Grace fell asleep, I sat by her crib, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. The moonlight spilled across her face, pale and perfect. I thought of everything I'd lost, and everything I'd found. Of Riley's anger, Daniel's patience, Ethan's redemption. Of my own silence, the one that had once felt like exile, but had turned into sanctuary. All of it led here. I leaned close and whispered, "You're born from every wound that healed, little one. Remember that." Grace stirred, her lips forming something that almost looked like a smile. The next morning, the house was still quiet when I woke. I slipped outside, wrapping my shawl tighter against the cold. The air smelled of snow and chimney smoke. I walked to the end of the street where the world opened into white fields. The horizon glowed faintly pink. Somewhere far away, the ocean was still moving, still keeping time for me. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time, I felt the circle close. The story that began with a cruel sentence, "The best gift would be if you disappeared," had found its ending in a single heartbeat against my chest. I hadn't disappeared. I had changed shape. I became the quiet proof that survival isn't just staying alive. It's learning how to live again, even after everything breaks. When I returned home weeks later, the cottage welcomed me like it had been waiting. The fire caught easily, the air warmed fast, and whiskers purred as if I'd never left. I placed a new photo on the mantel, Grace asleep in my arms, a soft smile on her face. Beside it, I left Daniel's old letter, Riley's key, and the journal that held every word of this long journey. It looked complete now. I sat by the fire, the sound of the sea whispering through the night. The waves rose and fell, steady as breath. I whispered to the flicker of the flames. I disappeared once, but in doing so I made room for everything that truly belonged to me. The house creaked softly, as if answering. Later, before bed, I opened the journal one last time and wrote the final entry. This is where it ends, not in anger, not in revenge, but in peace. They asked me to disappear, and I did. But what they didn't know is that disappearing was never the end. It was the beginning of becoming whole. I am no longer their story. I am my own. I closed the book, placed it gently beside the photo of Grace, and blew out the candle. The room fell into soft darkness, filled only with the sound of waves rolling against the shore. Outside, the sea breathed steady and endless, and inside I smiled, knowing that every scar had found its purpose, every silence had found its voice. The circle was closed. The story was home.